Okay, so let's get to, this, fateful day of 9/11. You've mentioned that you've been there with a certain job to do. And at one moment, I guess, everything happened. And what was the experience through your eyes? Can you walk me through your perceptions at that moment, your thoughts, your feelings?
Well, so at about 8:45, 8:46 in the morning, we heard kind of a muffled explosion. The building sort of shuddered, and then it began to tip, like I'm tipping my hand toward the camera. The building just began
Yeah.
to tip and tip and tip. Now, what you need to understand, and what people need to understand, and mostly don't,
Mm-hmm.
is that um, it wasn't the dog, it was me. But
Mm-hmm.
I spent time learning what to do, how to survive in the World Trade Center, how to work in the World Trade Center. I learned the emergency evacuation procedures. I learned everything I could about doing things in the World Trade Center. I learned where offices were. I learned where the restaurants were and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I had to do all that because I was the leader of an office. And so I needed to do what any office or any person who was a leader would do, including taking people to lunch and knowing where to go. So I learned all of that. And so for me, it was knowledge, not reading signs that said, oh, here's where the emergency exit was. Because if there were emergencies and the rooms were filled with smoke, then people wouldn't be able to see the signs anyway. So for me, it was a matter of knowing and actually being able to understand what to do. And I learned all of that so that on September 11th, the building began to tip. One of the things I also knew was that tall buildings are made with expansion joints. They're made to be able to blow around in the wind a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened several times in the World Trade Center when we had a good windstorm.
Mm-hmm.
So the tall buildings are made to do that. So when the building began to tip, though, what was going on was definitely unusual, but I understood what was happening. The building was tipping, and so I was in my office. I had a colleague from our corporate office who was in to help with the seminar that day, David Frank. David was in my office with me. Roselle was asleep under my desk. We had some early guest arrivals in our conference room, and they were eating breakfast. And so we, David and I, kind of tried to figure out what was going on. We had no clue. The building tipped maybe as much as 20 feet, and then it stopped and it started coming back the other way. We had just said goodbye to each other because we thought we were going to take a 78th floor plunge to the street. Well, that didn't happen. And so then the building got to be vertical again, and I went back into my office because I was standing in the open doorway between my office and our conference, our lobby area. I met Roselle coming out from under my desk. I took her leash. I told her to heel, which meant to come around behind me onto my left side and sit, which she did. And about the time Roselle sat, the building literally dropped about 6 feet.
Wow.
That's because the expansion joints went back to their normal configuration. Everything was working as it was supposed to, although most people didn't know that. So after the building stopped moving, David turned and looked out the window out because our office had a lot of windows, and he started shouting, "Oh my God, Mike, there's fire and smoke above us. There are millions of pieces of burning paper falling outside our window." And I could hear debris brushing by our window, and now I knew what it was. It was millions of pieces of burning paper. David was describing it. He said, "We got to get out of here right now." And I said, "Slow down, David." "No, we got to get out of here right now. We can't stay here." And I said, "Slow down, David." He said, "No, the building's on fire. We can't stay here." I said, "Slow down, David." And finally, he used what I call the big line. "You don't understand. You can't see it." Well, the problem wasn't what I wasn't seeing. It was what David wasn't seeing. That is to say that what David wasn't seeing was that sitting next to me was a dog wagging her tail, yawning and going essentially, "Who woke me up? I was sleeping really well here," and wasn't exhibiting any kind of fear. And so the result of that was that so Roselle wasn't giving me any indication that she had concerns. and was just sitting there wagging her tail. So I knew that whatever was going on wasn't such an imminent threat at that moment that we couldn't try to evacuate in an orderly way. And I finally got David to focus, and I said, David, get our guests to the stairs. Don't let them take the elevators. And then come back and we'll sweep the office and then we'll leave. Well, David got our guests together who were there and took them to the stairs. And then he came back, and I had called my wife meanwhile and let her know that something had happened. And we didn't know what was going on. We had no idea. Of course, everybody says, well, you didn't know because you couldn't see it, which is another stupid thing for people to say, to be real blunt about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality is the airplane struck on between the area between floors 93 and 99. So I just average it and say 96 on the north side of the building. I was on the south side of the building on the 78th floor. The last time I checked, no one could see through 18 floors of concrete, steel, and rebar. Nobody knew what was going on. And I'll prove that in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, people even today say, well, you were blind. Of course, you don't know what happened. And as I said, nobody did. Well, anyway, David came back. I had called my wife. I let her know that something was happening. I tried to call her later. We swept the office. We went to the stairs, and we started down. Almost immediately, I began smelling an odor, and it took me a while to realize that I knew what it was. It was familiar, but it took me 4 floors before I realized that what I was smelling were the fumes from burning jet fuel. And as soon as I realized that, I observed it to everyone around me. I said, I'm smelling the fumes from burning jet fuel. And they said, you're right. I knew the smell because I traveled a lot through airports, so I smelled it all the time. And now other people were going, you're right. It was burning jet fuel. Well, that's right. We must have been hit by an airplane. You see, nobody knew.
Mm-hmm.
But we figured out an airplane must have hit us because we were smelling jet fuel, but we didn't know the details. And so we just continued down the stairs. We all worked to help each other stay calm. I was being calm. And, we all worked together to make sure that everyone would not panic so that we could get down and get out of the building.
Mm-hmm. Wow. It's firstly very impressive to hear your intuitive analytical approach to the whole situation. Was it difficult for you to control your receptions at that point, or is it natural for you to always try to be rational and to approach difficult situations from this angle?
Well, I can be as concerned and afraid as anyone, but I'll always work to try to understand what's going on. I face a lot of surprises in my life. For example, for several years, I lived in the Boston, Massachusetts area when I worked for Ray Kurzweil. I could start across the street listening at the traffic, traveling the way I wanted to go so that I could cross the street. And then suddenly I hear a car coming and it doesn't seem to be slowing down, and it's not traveling the way I expect it to travel. I suddenly have to decide, do I go forward or do I go back, and make decisions as to what to do. I face that all the time. So for me, I was used to unexpected situations to a degree. And so the result is that I wasn't really facing anything so unusual. Yeah, I mean, it was. The World Trade Center had been hit by aircraft, but still, for me, it was more a matter of just staying focused and doing what I always did, and that's what I did to get out of the building.
Wow, that's amazing. Was there a moment that it was close to, to switch your equilibrium and to make you go into frenzy, and something that specifically made you afraid of the situation and lose control? Or did you just approach it in the sort of calm and calculated way we've been discussing?
Remember what I said earlier about guide dogs and their owners forming a team. So Roselle had to sense what was going on. That is, she had to sense the fear on the stairs and so on. So it was my job to keep her focused by telling her things like, you're doing a good job. Good dog, Roselle. Good girl. And so I worked to keep her focused as we went down the stairs, which of course also helped me. But the bottom line is that I worked with her so that we both did what we needed to do to be able to go down the stairs and get out without any panic. So I worked with her all the way down the stairs, and I worked to make sure that we succeeded very well as we went down the stairs to get out, which is what happened.
Wow. That's I think that's such a good lesson in terms of how people need to just base their instincts on on rules, on knowledge, and try to not lose control over the situation, I guess.
Most times people spend way too much time worrying about things over which they don't have control, and they also don't spend time dealing with what they can. You're right. People normally just depend on a sign that says, here's where the emergency exit is. This is what you have to do in an emergency. And they don't really learn it. They don't learn where things are, so that if they ever lose their eyesight for the moment because they're in a smoke-filled room, for example, they still know what to do.
Well,
humans were created with 5 senses, and some people only have 4 or 3, but you use the senses that you have. You don't just use one of them.
Well, that's incredibly well said. Yes, and I assume you really, during this experience, you really sense people, exactly losing their senses and losing control, and being chaotic and being afraid, and thus losing.
Not really, because we all worked. There were several people who worked, and people watched me and saw that I was calm, and that helped keep them calm. So we worked really hard to keep people from panicking as we went down the stairs. One of the things that happened at about the 50th floor, David suddenly said, "Mike, we're going to die. We're not going to make it out of here." And I just said in my loudest, sharpest voice, "Stop it, David. If Roselle and I can go down these stairs, so can you." And he told me later that that brought him out of his funk. But what he did is he then walked a floor below me, shouting up to me everything that he saw. Like, "I'm on the 48th floor, Mike." I was on floor 49. "I'm on the 48th floor. Everything is good here. We're going down the stairs." A few floors later, "I'm at the 44th floor. This is where the Port Authority cafeteria is, not stopping." And the reason I mention that is because David doing that had to be a tremendous help for anyone within the sound of his voice who heard someone who sounded calm, who sounded focused, who was shouting what was going on. And that had to help keep hundreds or maybe thousands of people from panicking as they went down the stairs.